Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel Get Cozy, or welcome if you're new here. In today's video, I am going to be discussing these two types of papers and assessing how fountain pen and ink friendly they are. So the first paper that I have here is called Crena paper. It's also known as Crena Spark or Crena Starbow. It's very thin, very reminiscent of Tomoe River paper. And then the other paper here that I have is called MiniJoy paper. It's a little bit thicker, it's a cream color, and reminiscent of Midori MD paper. So the reason I'm going to be discussing both of these in the same video is because these are two types of paper refills offered by MeePlus. MeePlus is a company based out of Hong Kong, and they create these really beautiful leather ring binder systems. So in this video, I'm going to give you a little bit of background on both of these types of papers. Then I'm going to do 4 different writing samples to simulate 4 different types of writing with fountain pens. We will assess the feathering, bleed through, ghosting, things like that on these papers, how inks sheen, shade. I'll talk more about that in a little bit. So I do just want to say thank you to MeePlus for sending these over. They didn't ask me to make this video. I'm just making it myself because I was really excited to be introduced to rings and incorporate that into my system. And in that, I have the thought of, well, what is the best paper to use with the rings? Yes, they have their own paper, but how good is the paper? Because there's a lot of different types of papers on the market that could be refills for MeePlus. So if I'm going to use these papers in my MeePlus binder, they need to be able to accomplish all of the things that I need as non-negotiables for being fountain pen friendly. Okay, so let's start with the Crena paper. I have 2 different kinds of Crena paper refills here from MeePlus. One is grids. I believe these are 3mm grids, and then the other one is blank paper. These are A5 size, and you can get them in packs of, I believe, about 100 sheets from their website. So Crena paper is owned by a company called Crena Paper, and they are from Guangdong province in China. This paper is very thin and light. It is only 50 GSM, so very similar to Tomoe River paper. If you look at this paper, on the front side, it has their Crena logo. So this just says Crena, the paper A5. And then if you look on the back, they have this STBR2 paper. STBR2 stands for Starbow Revision 2. So this is actually a second version of the Starbow paper. This is just the line of paper from the Crena Paper Company. It's also known as Spark paper. They previously had a version 1, so that would have been STBR1. So the version 1 of the Starbow paper was released around 2021, and there's a lot of community testing and feedback that said that the paper feathered a lot with fountain pen inks and had very long dry times. So the Crena Paper Company re-engineered the paper and improved it. For the version 2, the fiber pulp was re-engineered with their sizing treatment. So basically, this is when you add a starch or some kind of proprietary ingredient to the paper fibers before they are pressed into sheets of paper. And this helps to handle inks really well. Now, what's interesting about this paper that I haven't really seen before, this paper is treated with a resin, which is a proprietary ingredient, and this is intended to strengthen the paper and increase the durability of it. So being in a ring system in a binder, if you're flipping through papers a lot in all of your different pages, you want to make sure that they're not going to just rip out from the rings, right? And I can attest that, in my short month that I've had with this paper, I haven't had any issues with this paper tearing as I've flipped through the binder. So I do feel like this is pretty suitable for rings in that way. And then the other thing I want to mention about how this paper is produced is it does have a very thin surface coating. So it does feel slick to the touch. Honestly, it feels pretty similar to the texture of Tomoe River paper, but because it has that coating, it allows for the very slow absorption of ink. So as ink dries on this paper, it kind of sits on top and pools, and that's how you get the really beautiful sheening and shading properties that you're used to seeing on Tomoe River paper. So this is kind of seen as like a Tomoe River paper alternative. And back in around 2025, when the bad batch of Tomoe River paper came out, this paper gained a lot of popularity as a result, as just being an alternative. There's not really any stationers I could find in the US that stocked this paper. If you know of one, please leave a comment down below. But From what I could find, the easiest ways to get this paper would be from MeePlus, which do carry this paper with the pre-punched holes in different sizes. If you do order any from MeePlus, I do have a $10 off coupon, so I'll leave that in the description box. Let's talk about the MiniJoy paper. So this is the MiniJoy paper from MeePlus. It is thicker and denser than the Crena paper. It's also a cream colored paper, while the Crena paper is white. MeePlus has a variety of different types of MiniJoy paper prints on them. So this is a grid version. The grids on the MiniJoy paper are larger than the ones that I have on the Crena paper. So the Crena paper has, I believe, 3mm grids, and this one is 5mm. I also have lined, and I have this really cool fold out calendar, which I can show you in a little bit. This is a proprietary paper line by MeePlus, and it was created to be structured and heavy duty and durable for rings. So again, as you're like flipping through a binder, you're not having the paper tear as you're flipping through it. On the website for MeePlus, they mentioned that this paper has a specific type of sizing treatment, so it's supposed to handle fountain pen inks really well, be anti-feathering, anti-ghosting, and they do have a very distinctive fiber compression technology. So while it's very heavy and durable and dense, it's still relatively thin. And that's really important when you're using something like this, which is a ring system, and the ring size are intended to be a bit more on the smaller side. I have the largest ring size they have, which is 16mm, but they also have 10mm and 13, which is pretty small. I mean, you're not going to be able to fit just like a ton of sheets of paper in here. It's intended to be minimal and more scaled back. It seems that this paper doesn't have a coating on it like the Crena paper. So while it is fountain pen friendly in a different way without having the coating, it does have the sizing, but because it doesn't have the coating, it's not as slick. It's a bit more toothy. You can feel the texture of the paper grain, so it feels more papery in that respect. Very reminiscent of Midori MD paper. I am going to do a writing test. So I have 4 different types of writing samples that I want to simulate. Okay, so the first writing sample is going to be a baseline. So the pen that I have for this is a Pilot Kakuno with a fine nib, and I have Pilot Black ink in here, which this is intended to be something that's just representative of standard note taking. It's not too wet, it's not too dry, just very standard. This paper is really slick and smooth. I think on this paper, it just feels a little bit smoother because of the coating that we have on here. But it still feels like paper, if that makes sense. All right, we're going to do a 10-second dry test. I have an iPod here as a stopwatch. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a small writing sample, and then I'm going to start the timer for 10 seconds and then see how badly it smears. So let's do that. And then next what I'm going to do is a fingerprint test. So I'm going to put my fingers on this paper to get my hand oils on here and then write over it. I find that some papers don't handle hand oils very well. So wherever you touch the paper and you put ink on top of it, it doesn't absorb the ink very well. It can look really patchy. So I'm going to put my fingerprints on this paper and write over it to see if the ink looks weird or patchy. Next, let's do the dry writing sample. This is with the Pelikan M800. I have an extra fine nib, and I'm going to be using Pelikan 4001 Blue Black. I have a video testing this ink in all of my pens, so I will link that video down below. So this is a dry ink, and this is a Pelikan M800, an extra fine nib, and Pelikan 4001 Blue Black. This ink has really pretty shading. I really love the color of this ink. Okay, let's do the 10-second dry test. I can definitely tell that this paper takes a little bit longer to dry than some of the other papers I've tried. All right, so next let's do the fingerprint test. Okay, I can see that there is a little bit of hand oil issues right here. All right, next we're going to be doing the wet and juicy writing sample. This is with the Pilot Custom 823. I have a medium nib. And for this one, I have Iroshizuku Tsukio. The sheening and shading in this ink is really, really nice. So a little bit of impact from there. And last but not least, we are going to do the stress test. So this is going to be with the dip pen and with Sailor Yorimiku Kiyakuya ink. All right. All right, let's do a 10-second dry test. All right. So there you have it. Okay, now we are going to do the MiniJoy paper. Okay, so I'm going to do all of the same writing samples and the same tests, but I'm going to speed the whole thing up, and then afterwards we will do some comparisons and talk about how the papers handled the fountain pens. Oh my gosh, I just realized I forgot to do the swatch test for the Sailor ink. Let me do that really quickly. Let's look closely at all of these writing samples, and then we'll talk about them, we'll compare them to the other papers. Let's start with the Crena Spark paper. I think overall, because of the coating on this paper, the dry test didn't perform that well. You can see that the ink did smear quite a bit for every single ink type. This is how the first writing sample looks close up. This is the baseline standard writing sample with the Pilot Kakuno. You can see that the lines are super crisp. There's like no feathering whatsoever. And this ink doesn't typically have any kind of shading, but there's a little bit of a sheen that you can see from the ink swatch. So that's really nice to see. And then as far as the fingerprint test goes, didn't really seem to impact the writing sample for this ink specifically. Now let's talk about the dry ink. So this is with the Pelikan M800. This is one of my favorite inks because it does have really beautiful shading. So you can see that there are some areas of the writing that look light, some that look dark. I think it looks so pretty on this paper. Not a ton of sheen. It did probably the best on the dry test compared to the other inks, probably because it is a drier ink. And for the fingerprint test, it did seem to have a little bit of an impact for my hand oil, as you can see, especially in the G and the bottom part of the F. things are looking a tiny bit splotchy. I'm gonna be transparent. In this writing sample, I did something a little bit different. I kind of rubbed my finger on my nose and then put it on the page to get more oils on the page. So it's a bit extreme. I honestly have not really seen impact from hand oils on this paper in my day-to-day up to this point. I'm not usually like rubbing my face and then touching paper, but I wanted to make sure that I was doing a thorough test. I'm going to talk about this again with a rollful paper, so we'll get to that. And then let's talk about the Pilot Custom A23 with Tsukio. I am very happy to say, again, super crisp lines, no feathering at all whatsoever, and look at that really awesome sheen from this ink. This paper really does make that ink pop, and it looks very nice and blue. You can get some really pretty shading in the writing sample as well. Did not do well with the dry test, so this will be one that takes a long time to dry on this paper. I would say the fingerprint test is similar to the Pelican 4001 Blue Black result. And then finally the stress test at the bottom, very crisp lines, no feathering, and did not do well on the dry test. The fingerprint test, I would say it performed the worst with this ink. Okay, so next let's talk about the MiniJoy paper. So this paper is cream, unlike the Crena paper, which is white, and it is a bit denser. Very, very crisp lines. I would say there are some areas that are not the most crisp, but that's if I'm like being super picky. So you can see that at the bottom of the B right there. And then also the I in Pilot, the top of this line and the cross strokes. So I wouldn't really call this feathering. I feel like it's more so just like some of the fibers of the paper are longer than others. So for the most part, it's pretty crisp, but not as crisp as the Crena paper. Now, this did handle the dry test much better. I would say the ink dries pretty quickly on this, and the Pilot Black ink does not sheen really at all. And then as far as the fingerprint test goes, it didn't really seem to be impacted. All right, now let's talk about Pelican 4001 Blue Black. Similar in terms of like line crispiness. There's some really beautiful shading that is picked up. Like look at the A in Pelican, it's lighter on top, and then there's other areas that look darker, so it looks very pretty. The ink swatch doesn't have any kind of sheening. The dry test did okay, did pretty good on this paper, and tiny bit of impact from the fingerprint test, but not a lot. All right, next we have the wet and juicy writing sample. The dry test, it did pretty well. It dried pretty quickly. You can definitely see impact from fingerprints here. You can even see the lines of my fingerprints from this one. So I would say for whatever reason, this ink performed the worst with the fingerprint test on this paper specifically. Unfortunately, there's like no sheening from this ink on the page. But I do think overall, like it generally looks pretty nice. And then here is the last one. This is the stress test with the Kakimori dip pen. This is one of those inks that can look brown or gray or green. On this paper, I think it looks more green, and I really prefer how the color pops on this paper versus some of the other ones that I've tried this ink on. The dry test, I think, performed the worst with this ink on this paper. And then the fingerprint test is similar to the Iroshizuku ink. You can see the lines of my fingerprints on there. And then no sheening, not a ton of shading either. All right, so let's compare these to some of the other papers. First, I'm going to pull out the rollful paper because I want to talk about the fingerprint test. This paper is not my favorite. I'm going to be completely honest. I talked about this in a previous video, but when I was doing a review on this paper, for the fingerprint test, I just kind of put my fingers down to see if it would impact the inks, and it wasn't really as drastic as I had seen it previously. But for instance, you can definitely see that there is an impact from hand oils on this page. So it's definitely there. So when I was doing this video, I was just putting my fingerprints on the page, but I wasn't getting the same exact result. And I think it just depends on like how sweaty I am. I don't know. But for future fingerprint hand oil tests to like rub my nose or my face with my finger and then put it on the paper. So these were tested much more harshly than the rollful paper. And I can say in my day-to-day, I have seen the hand oils impact the writing on a rollful paper more than I have on these two. So just want to put that disclaimer out there. All right, so I want to spend some more time comparing against these two. So let's start with Crena Spark with Tomoe River paper, and then we'll do MiniJoy with Midori, just because those are the paper types that these remind me of. All right, so starting with the first one, I would say that the line crispiness is pretty similar between the two, as well as the line width. And then as far as the sheening goes, I definitely think it's popping more on the Tomoe River paper in comparison to the Crena paper. Okay, and then as far as the Pelican writing sample goes, I don't really see any differences. The color looks the same, the line crispiness looks the same, the sheening looks the same. So very, very similar there. And then for the Pilot Custom 823, again, very similar. Maybe a little bit more blue in the ink swatch on the Tomoe River paper, but as far as everything else goes, I mean, the shading and the sheening looks very similar on both. So I don't really see many differences there. And then finally, for the stress test, again, very, very similar. I mean, I have to say, I do think that these are pretty identical. I haven't done a hand oil test or 10-second dry test yet for the Tomoe River paper, so stay tuned for that. Now let's just check the backs of these. Okay, so definitely ghosting on both. I would say it's pretty comparable between the two. I don't really see a lot of differences. No bleed through really, except for that first ink swatch on the Tomoe River paper. But yeah, I would say the ghosting is very, very similar. As far as the feel of the writing, I don't really feel a difference. Both are also very crinkly. These are very, very, very similar. So I do think that calling this like a Tomoe River paper alternative is definitely, definitely fair. Okay, so let's compare the MiniJoy paper versus Midori MD paper. I would say that the dry test is similar for the Pilot ink. For the Pelican writing sample, definitely better on the Midori MD paper. You can see there's a lot less smearing on this paper versus the MiniJoy paper. For Orochizuku Tsukio, the dry test actually seemed better on the MiniJoy paper. There's less smearing compared to the Midori paper. And then I would say for the stress test, they're pretty similar. I don't know how much of this is ink dependent between the two. It seems that sometimes the MiniJoy paper is the same as the Midori paper. Sometimes one is better than the other. So, take that with what you will. As far as the fingerprint test goes, it's not truly comparable because, as I've already mentioned, I was a little harsher in today's review compared to my previous reviews. All right, let's do some close-up comparisons on the baseline writing sample. The MiniJoy paper, it does have like those random spots where it seems maybe the paper fibers or the pulp is like a little bit longer or ununiform. So you have like those random small spots where the ink seems to spread a little bit. The Midori paper, I've never seen that before, so we can look really closely, but I don't really see that anywhere. It's not really that big of a deal. It's not really something that impacts my day-to-day writing, but that is just one thing to note. And then as far as line width goes, I would say on the MiniJoy paper, it looks a little bit thicker for this writing sample compared to the Midori MD paper. Next, let's talk about the Pelican writing samples. Line crispiness is kind of the same between the two. The shading looks pretty good on both, I have to say. And then again, the line width for this writing sample is thicker on the MiniJoy paper compared to the Midori notebook. Next, Pilot Custom A23. Definitely more sheening from this ink on the Midori paper. You can see that purple coppery sheen on the swatch there. On the MiniJoy paper, it's very flat and very matte. I would love to see this engineered to show off sheening better. And the shading looks pretty good on both. As far as the line width, I think they're pretty similar to each other. And then for the stress test, there is a tiny bit of feathering for both papers. The color on the Midori paper for the Sailor ink looks a little bit more olive green. For the MiniJoy paper, it still looks green, but a little bit more gray. And then as far as the line width goes, I would say that they're pretty comparable. So that's how they compare. Now, let's look at the back. This is where I think the MiniJoy paper really excels. There's no ghosting. Definitely no bleed through. For the Midori paper, there is a little bit of ghosting. It's definitely not bad. This paper is less dense, so maybe that's why. And then this is how it looks with the dip pen. Okay, so I hope those comparisons were helpful between Crena and Tomoe River paper and MiniJoy paper versus Midori. Let me show you how I've been using them in my MeePlus SlimPad. So the MiniJoy paper has a lot of different refill options. So one of my favorites is this like pull out calendar. And I find it really useful to have this on a thicker paper because I'm constantly coming in here and pulling it out. And I feel like the paper is very snappy and holds up really well to a lot of use and flipping and pulling. And then this is some Crena paper. I've been using this for some like brain dump notes. I find that it's been really great for things that are either a little bit more temporary or for cases where I really just want to show off the ink. So as you can see on this page, even though this paper has ghosting, I've been able to use the back of it. So aside from content planning, I'm also using this binder for an ink swatch log. I made a video on this that I posted already, so I will link that down below. This has been really, really fun. I've really enjoyed doing this. So that's how I've been using those papers just kind of generally in the past month. Okay, so let's close on whether I like them more than my other favorite papers. Let's start with Crena, because I would say it's very comparable to Tomoe River paper. I didn't really observe any differences, honestly, between this paper and the Tomoe River paper. So definitely a suitable alternative, in my opinion, if you want to have a paper like Tomoe River paper in a ring binder. This, I think, is a great option, and I do recommend it. With the MiniJoy paper compared to Midori MD paper, I don't think these are as close as the Tomoe River paper and the Crena paper. The Midori paper is a bit yellower, and to me that's a con on the Midori paper. I prefer the color of the MiniJoy paper. Also, the MiniJoy paper doesn't ghost at all. The Midori MD paper does. As far as line crispiness goes, the Midori paper has to win on that front. I just think that there's less fuzziness on the lines, and also the line width is a bit finer on the Midori paper, which is a preference that I have. And then also Midori MD paper shows off ink sheening a lot better. The MiniJoy paper is pretty good, but I do think that I prefer the Midori MD paper overall. All right, so those are my thoughts on these papers. I think overall these are both really great options for binder. I really like these. I specifically really enjoy the Crena Spark paper. I think it is really fantastic. I think my biggest complaint is the dry time. It does take a little bit of time, but so does Tomoe River paper. I don't know. I think this is just one of my favorite papers I've ever tried, to be honest. The MiniJoy paper, it's really good. I'm going to continue using it, and I would definitely still consider repurchasing it. But I do think that there are some areas of improvement, primarily with the line crispiness, and then also with how ink sheening is handled. But overall, I really like both of them, and I think that they are great alternatives for some of my favorite papers to include in a binder system. So I would love to know, have you ever tried these papers? What are your thoughts? Would you consider trying these? I'm very curious to see how these compare to other papers for ring systems like Plotter and Filofax. So I haven't explored those yet. Let me know down in the comments if you have experience with those. I hope you're having a wonderful day. If you like this video, I would really appreciate a thumbs up or a subscribe. And with that, I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching. Bye!